Who's facilitating this?
Well, Cara. And he's not I mean, I can start now if y'all are mentally prepared to receive me, to be impregnated by my thoughts. So, I guess I plan to start talking about how I really always kind of struggled with school. Not really when it comes to like grades, but just in doing the work. And it normally shows itself in small ways, having to do with homework and general procrastination on large projects. And it wasn't really until the third semester of studios here that it kind of came to a head. Also, it was COVID, so it kind of exasperated it. But to make a long story short, it wasn't until this year that I was diagnosed with ADHD, and it kind of put things in new perspective. And since then, I wanted to take a look at how education here kind of treats with people with ADHD. To start with like defining ADHD, I did end up making a timeline at the very end there that I really wanted to highlight how new of a discovery the kind of, I guess, illness is. In the early 1900s, there was a shift from, instead of considering people were lazy for moral reasons, it was more of a consideration that there might genuinely be something different about these people. Research estimates that anywhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 people will show symptoms of ADHD, which is much more than I ever considered. Because before I kind of started my understanding, I was one of the people that didn't really believe in it, mostly because my parents didn't. We don't fully know how it works, other than it's a neurological condition that recent research has tied it to a problem mostly with dopamine, which in turn affects executive dysfunction. This affects what people normally associate with ADHD, like focusing and remembering details, which is called working memory. It also affects organization, time management, and controlling your emotions. The growing understanding is something called low arousal theory, which has nothing to do with the impregnation part earlier, which pretty much states that people with ADHD have areas in their brain that have lower levels of stimulation, which causes them to seek it out, which is why stimulants are often prescribed. To get moderately technical, there are two forms of dopamine, both tonic, which is the kind of dopamine that is just kind of floating around, sitting in your brain, and phasic, which is the dopamine that your neurons release whenever you are stimulated. Think about like completing a task or seeing something you like. People with ADHD have low levels of tonic dopamine, so whenever the phasic dopamine occurs, it's a much bigger response. So if you like to think about it, if you imagine whatever you're doing at the current time, you don't have enough dopamine in your brain to keep you focused compared to the next thing that you notice, which causes problems with motivation, especially when it comes to like long term. And the implications for school are moderately dire for people with ADHD, whether or not they're aware of it. GPAs, this is a graph actually of people's GPAs. This is the normal people's GPAs. It hovers around 3.5, and these are both GPAs of, or GPA trends over 8 semesters of people that have ADHD, both medicated and non-medicated. They also often drop out more often, which is this graph down here. It shows dropouts over each semester, which it's actually kind of interesting that they kind of coincide every 2 semesters. This isn't to say that people with ADHD don't really fit within design spaces. If you were to change, skip to the thing. I was gonna say, architecture school is kind of like ADHD kryptonite. If you think of the qualities in an architecture program, large long-term projects, time management, self-directed work, and an iterative design process, attention to detail, presentation skills, even studio culture, which is just a busy, loud, distracting space, are all things that poorly coincide, which does not mean that ADHD people don't fit within these spaces. There are several benefits come to ADHD that mostly come within a design process, like ideation and problem solving. But whenever I was doing this research, I was thinking to myself, almost where do I go from here with this project? I started with looking into the history and practice of architecture pedagogy, which I went from the École de Beaux Arts all the way to the Bauhaus until they came over to the US with MIT and the Texas Rangers, Cooper Union. And I began trying to write my thoughts on how I would design my own set of projects, especially when it coincides with people with ADHD. Unfortunately, around this point, I hit a snag. I was unable to really articulate where I was trying to go with the project, so I kind of shut down. This was around the end of September, and I knew I needed to switch gears. I was probably going to burn myself out. So I took some of the research from ADHD and took some of the principles and tried to apply them to something that I was never able to finish myself. I tried multiple years to do it, but I just never was. What I'm talking about is during October, artists come together and do Inktober, which they produce an illustration for every day of the month based off of these topics that they release online. And I set a goal to do it, and I finally did for the first time. Kind of trying to use some of the processes that I tried to identify as problems. Also, during this time, I planned to visit the University of Milwaukee. There I interviewed several of their teachers, I sat in on a few of their classes, and I was able to explore their school for several days. They offered me a lot of their documents, which right here shows all of the materials they offer their students in their first design semester. It shows, it breaks down each project in each line, and it gives a really good explanation for what they expect for students. They break it down on their timelines and exact expectations. But the one thing I could never nail down from them was how you grade the students. Whenever I was doing research into ADHD in particular, that is one thing that students really struggled with, or really students generally as I started to dig into it. I started thinking about research grading methodologies, and I want to find out what methods work in places that help these students. One thing I discovered that was most important was just defining the objectives that the student and teacher expected throughout the semester, and then trying to figure out which grading methods go with those objectives. Where is that? These graphs here, these kind of smaller ones, they start to talk about how students were really interested in this idea of grading the kind of more abstract concepts that you can't really capture with kind of quantitative grading, the ABC scale. And it was interesting, they all said they wanted it graded, but they don't want it graded with ABC, they just want feedback. Another study that I looked into just talked broadly about the main things students want through teaching. They don't want ABCs, they just want to know where they went wrong and how they can do better. And on the flip side, the teachers in that same study were like, we'd love to give you more feedback, but we are literally only paid per student 15 minutes per 10-page paper, and we do not have the time to give you the kind of feedback you asked for. We have time to read the paper and give you a grade based off of essentially a 5, which I don't really love, but it's kind of in a difficult position because the students need these things and the teachers are not given the materials they need to do it. I looked into a study here, which I found very interesting, that had to do with, it was from Delft University, and they wanted to measure if they could increase their students' design thinking through evaluation. So essentially they had their students in design studios write papers on what they did, and they showed that over the course of the semester, it went up by about 5 to 10% on their grading scale, which is moderately significant. One study I found that was very interesting, that I don't really know if I believe it, it pretty much based their whole entire class while they graded only their attendance. They based it towards about 70% of the grade was just showing up to class. And what they found was they saw an uptick in attendance, and once they were going to class and the weight of the grade was off their shoulders, they performed better in class, did better on testing, and met their course objectives on a better and more reliable scale. Ball State University, their architecture department, which is the majority of this, they outline their assignment structure really well, and they have 4 or 5 different grading methodologies that they assign per assignment, which I found very interesting. They use something called ungrading, which removes the grade entirely and the student just receives feedback. They have specifications grading, which mostly has to do with just like rubrics. They have a rubric up here that has, like for example, their visual notes section, which they expect students every single lecture to make notes on it, they grade it only on how many they complete. And if they do it, congratulations, you get the grade. And they have several other methods, like one that I really liked was something they called summative grading, which allows a student to come up with, it could be an interview or a paper or some kind of overall presentation that shows that they actually learned in the class. Although that one still had the issue of the teacher just assigned a grade. They also occasionally used peer grading, but they didn't really talk much about that. I've worked pretty extensively on pass-fail systems, which has not been broadly adopted in the US, but I think show promise. My ideal scenario that I think would be very interesting to see is almost like a pass-fail system that has a drop-down for grades on individual topics, so you can see how well you did in each section and determine where, overall you passed. But as you drop down to see the different objectives in the course, those have individual grades that can show how a student can do better overall. I think it'd be very interesting that if in the same part, the teacher would leave actual feedback and notes, and I think it'd be interesting if the student can then comment on their own transcript as well. It makes me think about one of the best studio experience I had here is when I took Dan Powers, and he was the first teacher that ever gave me written feedback on how a project went. Until then, it was just like, all right, jury's over, you go home, and you just wait for a grade, and once it appears, cool. There's never really anything after that. But moving past pass-fail systems, I tried to wonder how you could quantify not only effort, but design thinking. And using what I tried to learn from the iterative design and producing Ever Drawing Every Day during October, I came to this idea of using journals. Because as I produced something every day, it did help me get into a mindset of problem solving in this narrative generation. I imagined a class where every bit of design thought had to be recorded before you meet with a teacher. It's essentially like, if you want to make plans, you draw a plan. If you, whatever you need to do to figure out the project, do it, as long as you're doing something. And the idea is that the teacher then works off of this journal, explains in detail in the journal where you want you to go forward, as well as any notes for further study and the expectations for next class, along with potentially like tailor-made assignments for the student. I think about if you're a student that wants to dive into a specific area of a project, let them do that if that's where they can actually make a cohesive and interesting thought. And if the student comes next class and has done what's suggested or has taken a different approach, they can show how they progress. The aim is to address the problem students come into class and show that have nothing to show the teacher. In my experience, if the student has nothing to show, then generally the teacher moves on. And that approach is different from what I'm normally seeing. Whenever I explained this concept to Cook the other day, he seemed actually genuinely blown away. He shared that he often moves on from one student if they don't have anything to show because he wants to give them the space to come up with it themselves. And I try to explain to him that as someone with ADHD, sometimes the hardest step is to do that first bit of design, to write down something. And I told him that sometimes the best thing a teacher can do is sit down with a student and ask them genuinely, where are you stuck? What do you not understand? And where can we go forward? To sit down and say, let's draw something together. Write down what you think right now. I'm going to come back and then we will actually draw out all your thoughts. To not leave the student in this kind of odd space of not knowing where to go. Which is what this kind of graphic, I tried to get, kind of abstractly out of my head for the kind of feeling that you get whenever you get stuck in this like snowball process. Because in my experience, it would kind of be like, you get stuck on something, you don't produce, you come to class the next time, and the teacher moves on. It's fine. But it starts to reinforce this idea of why are you going at all? If you have nothing to show, why go? Sometimes I'd catch up, sometimes I wouldn't, but the next time I wouldn't have something, I would just say, I'm not gonna go. And it would disincentivize me from attending class and actually engaging in the thing that probably would have helped me move forward. And the more you don't go, the more everybody else in the class moves past you. And when you come back and you see that you're actually way behind than you ever were, you then shut down further. And in my experience, it isn't until really the week or two before a due date comes that the adrenaline kicks in and finally gets you out of this malaise. And in my experience, I would complete the work, but it would never be as cohesive and thought out as it could have been if I would have worked consistently over an entire semester and had actual feedback. So, the idea is at the end of the semester, a teacher can use this journal, see the conversation they had with the student writing their thoughts, with them telling them their expectations for next class, and see if the student hits these benchmarks, and then that's what they can grade on. They have a record of everything the student has done and said. With the exercises and kind of projects that I have written so far, I wanted to propose a way forward for this project, which I want to take into a spatial realm. My goal is to create idealized conceptual rooms within a broader architectural school, and mapping out how I see the class being run, and using spatial concepts to actually use architecture to reinforce them. Simple concepts, conceptual spaces that align with teaching methodologies such as open studios for collaboration or enclosed spaces for focus, and outlining how all these concepts can be further cemented. There's a lot of really broad sections of my thesis so far that I just want to be able to explain through space. And the reason that I said making conceptual rooms rather than an entire conceptual school is because I don't think there's one correct way to teach architecture. I think the methods that I've thought about and tried to outline would help certain students, or maybe even help all students broadly. But I know there are different ways and different methods that help other people more than others. But that's I probably have more thoughts on that. But now it's time where I can take your questions, comments, and recommendations for.
Great presentation, well spoken, very easy to follow. I did notice, or I felt that there was a little bit of a disconnect between the ADHD and the overall research that's been done on learning, or how best to learn. So it felt like the research for learning was more broad, right, just in general, and there wasn't a whole lot of ADHD specific research. Is that something you do you plan on focusing more on how architectural education or education in general can be done better, like taking the pressure off by not doing grades, doing pass or fail, being graded more on attendance? Or do you plan on moving forward focusing, really dialing in on ADHD research?
I think the research into ADHD has brought me to this. Originally, I wanted to have a thesis that didn't go into ADHD. I wanted to say these things will broadly help everybody. And it wasn't until I kind of made the connection that it really was about ADHD that was the reason that I struggled, and that's what inspired me to get into it broadly. So I feel like it'd be wrong to not bring in those original concepts, but it is kind of the timeline of my project has really been way more broad generally, just looking at how can I improve it for everybody generally, and this is how the motivations originally were spurred on by these concepts of ADHD and the problems that the program can have for people that have that with it.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So just in terms of presentation, I think when you do your opening portion of it, if you begin maybe speaking about the broader education, those broader issues, and then bring in the focus on ADHD, would make that more clear.
Okay.
And doing more research also on specifically learning with ADHD, right?
Yes.
What, very specifically what?
One problem I had with that was the majority of ADHD research is in children that are around 7. Because it isn't until around, what was it? In around 1987 is when they recognized that children that had ADHD can become adults that still have ADHD. And it isn't until very, very recently that it's even considered that you can be an adult that has ADHD that was not recognized as a child, which is very interesting. For example, if you show symptoms of ADHD but you do not show symptoms whenever you were a child, they will not diagnose you with ADHD still.
Well, I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and I was never diagnosed as a child.
Me neither. That whenever I was talking to my therapist about it, she had said if I would have answered that on the childhood section of the kind of questionnaire she gave me, if I would have answered that I didn't show any symptoms, she technically would not have been able to diagnose me with ADHD. Just because the way the DSM-5 currently works is that it is a childhood disease, or the onset is in childhood. And they kind of recognize that even if your onset was in childhood, it's never really, you might not have needed the actual help, or you just didn't know there was any until adulthood. But there's a very interesting thing about kind of the people that did have ADHD but were kind of left behind because they didn't know that they did and didn't have the kind of resources to get to it. So now you have a bunch of adults that are like, oh, me too. I have these problems, and there's not a lot of research as to help them now. There was plenty because, things that work as a child work as an adult, but there's much less of that resource around. So when I was looking at, I go like in elementary school, I'm like, well, I'll read it, but it doesn't feel like it applies as much, which is honestly what kind of spurred some of this because one of the things I actually left out a board that had ADHD research just because I didn't know how to format it. But they talk about the common accommodations for students. The most common one is more time on tests, but how do you translate that to architecture? How do you accommodate someone that you're just in these big projects? And that's what I was trying to figure out.
So I think if there's not a whole lot of research done on adults with ADHD, it might be a good idea for you to, because it is going more common, right? At least 2 people in this room, maybe more, have it and have been through this program, right? So yeah, you have sort of a pool to choose from to start doing exactly what you're doing in the other realms of your project and start doing interviews. In what ways did you struggle in this program that you now believe are related?
And that's one thing I've been trying to do, and I was not recommended to, but I'm just going to do it anyways. For example, Cook has ADHD, and so does Weston. I already talked to Cook pretty extensively, and I'd like to get with Weston if I could get him to respond to something else, which doesn't help that he, is a little out there. Did y'all have any comment?
I think you should talk to Bob.
He's going to be part of my committee.
Yes, Bob has really great perspective on how to make students feel comfortable inside the studio, even if they don't have anything. In the studio that I'm in this semester, there has been really good attendance compared to what I've seen in the past ones that I've been in, and I think it's because of the way that Bob approaches design. He'll literally do exactly what you said. Okay, you don't really have anything. Where do we go from here? Let's draw something together. Let's do this. What do you want? What do you feel about it? And it's really resonated with what you said.
Yeah, me too.
And it's not that I wanted to, especially pick on any teachers that don't do that. It's just I think not all of them know that that's the thing that will help students. That's one thing that I proposed in some of the things I wrote was for MP1, I think it'd be very interesting if the first and only assignment that every student has is to write their own syllabus. They write down what they plan to study, what they plan to create, what they plan to produce. They give it to their chair. The chair makes sure, that's enough stuff. They sign off on it, and that's what they end up becoming graded on, which I think would be very helpful for students to see exactly, because when I got to the end of the semester, and I talked with Cara, I was like, how are we doing this presentation? And he was like, oh, well, you just need to have a lot of graphics. I was like, oh, I didn't know that, I don't have any. So I got to make some, which has been fun.
You did a pretty good job pulling that together.
Thank you.
I can't tell that you.
It helps that I had some of it. Like, I mean, this I already had written. This I didn't plan to use this, but I think it applies, especially helping me get into the mindset of using some of the concepts I learned, like I said. And then, yeah, the other ones were pretty fun to put together.
So you said a few things that really interested me. One of them is talking about how this was one of the first things that you were able to like make that plan and stick to it. I would love for you to go a little more in depth. It doesn't have to be during this time, but maybe in the future, a little more in depth about exactly why you think that kept your interest.
Drugs.
Drugs. Well, maybe
which is not, you know,
expand on that a little bit.
which is not the best when it comes to like action. I want to be able to help people that don't want to
So are
rely
you
on
being
medication.
serious though about drugs? That's
Well,
what helps.
prescribed drugs.
Okay, right, of course. So
But yes, they genuinely.
if you
I mean,
were
it's
on
crazy.
if you were on this prescription
Yes.
medication, do you think that
I don't
would
think I
help
would've-
you during school?
Absolutely. I don't think I would have ever struggled as much as I did. I mean, there are certainly things that I had issues with regardless of just being able to do it, especially when it comes to like clarity of projects and understanding what I'm being graded on. Those are the two things that I feel like were very much missing throughout my studios here. Not only would I often not understand what they were asking me to do, but I would also not understand how they're grading me afterwards, and I would just sit and like, well, I don't really know, or this kind of terrible thought because I wouldn't know how much to do, so I would see what other people do and make sure I would at least hit that much. Those would be the benchmarks I hit. Whenever I wish there were written benchmarks that a student would be recommended to hit, but then would be encouraged to go past. You know, explore as far as you want, but I want to set in some of the projects that I met almost like minimum benchmarks with maximum potential. Yes.
Good question. Is this project going to identify any ADHD characteristics in students, or are you only looking at the curriculum as a whole to improve it for everybody?
What do you mean?
As you adjust the curriculum related to ADHD, is this something you're going to do across the board? Like if you had a classroom, it would be for everyone with or without ADHD?
Yeah. So I think the ADHD and the research I did helped me identify exactly where some of the problems that I struggled with, and then the project is going to attempt to try to work those out, and I think they'll help everybody. I don't know how they couldn't, at least.
I'm especially interested in your idea of grading students differently. I think when you take the design pressure off of stuff, like what brings up, for me anyway at least, what brings up that wall is being afraid of doing a bad design, of being afraid that I'm not, like the decisions I'm making aren't in the right direction, and then you end up working yourself in circles because you build something and you take it away and you do something else, and really you're working a lot, but in the end you don't have a whole lot to show for it because you're just second guessing yourself. And if in teaching you take that, like you were saying, you take that pressure off and say, look, come in with a bad design because we can do something with that. I can give you feedback on that. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, but that's something that Mark Weston did for me at one point. I had this really bizarre idea for a project, and at first he said, I don't know, like that if you're a little early in the program to attempt something like that, I don't know if you're ready for it. And I said, I would really love to do this and fail at it. And he said, okay, let's do it. And he let me do it, and I failed at it, right? It was not good. But the feedback I got from, like, having done it and having done it not well, and the feedback I got during that, I learned so much from that. We learn way more from our failures than we do for our successes. And if we set up a learning environment that really allows us to just
Do something bad.
Yeah, to do something bad, to just be 100% ourselves and just throw all we have
And
at
this-
it.
I really like the idea of using these, like really strictly using these journals, because as you said, as you like made, but then at the end you show one thing. I want to see, as a teacher, everything that you did and thought about to get to that final product. I want to understand your thinking throughout, so I can see where you're going and try to lead you forward. And then also, if you're grading off of the thinking that they're doing, rather than the product that they do, it's just, like you said, less weight on the student. I had thought, I can't think about what I was going to say next. One of the things that really interested me was even the idea of adding in more writing into architecture. Or I talk with Cook about this a lot, talking about offering students differing ways to go about a project if they think they can do it better. So if you assign a certain exercise in a certain way, and a student comes to you and says, I don't understand it, I'm not getting it, I don't think it will help, they say, okay, what do you think you should be doing? And then let them do that. Almost taking like having a structure that students want to use, they totally can, but then taking the training wheels off and telling them, and if you want to do something else, we will work together as a student-teacher combo to do that. Because if you can label design objectives and learning objectives in the classroom and then minimum requirements, you can tailor make those to any project. I even think about master's presentations generally. I mean, students do whatever they want, but they end up doing the same quality or amount of work, generally speaking. And it's normally better than some of the work that they do in other classes, because they're just free to do to pursue what interests them. Cook gave me a pamphlet that explained the pedagogy from the school that he went to, because as he described it, they kind of threw him to the wolves to just make things. And as I read it, they talked about essentially having a free student a free studio that they called a laboratory, where students can do whatever they want while having access to all these different teachers. And the goal was to create their own projects and then figure out from each teacher what they can get from them to fully see it to come to reality, which is interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah, that's what I got. I think I have 15 minutes that I need to fill.
No, you're not professional. So hold the applause.
I do have a question. I don't know if, correct me, especially running, because you probably know better than me, but I know for, okay, sorry, ADHD, but how do you think you're gonna portray this into all of this research and your knowledge about improving curriculum and teaching methods into architecture?
I'm glad you asked. That's a perfect question. So, right now I have 2 projects that I've outlined that kind of have a few different design methodologies and exercise to teach kind of the core fundamentals. And I want to use those projects and do those projects with a little bit of a twist to kind of experiment with them, see if they work, see if they actually are interesting for teaching, but then use those to explore some of the more broad abstract concepts. So using these, almost like intro 1, intro 2, core 1, 2, core 2 level abstract models to kind of just visually show these concepts, while the concepts themselves speak for themselves in writing. So if I have, an exercise talking about, this journaling concept generally, using one of these models and using some of these processes from these projects, I will, expand on them and try to show it in an abstract spatial expression. Also, I talked with Cook about looking at different. I'll give an example of one of the projects involves taking a precedent, studying it, and then creating a journey for the individual occupant. Taking what isn't necessary on that journey and removing everything else, and then showing that diagrammatically, and then rebuilding something on top of it. And I think if I can imagine taking an architect, or taking a design school, coming up with a story of a student within it, and then removing everything that distracts them. and then rebuilding something new on top that gives them a better space to design within. Or I talked with Cook, he specifically with the idea of journals, he had said it would be interesting to almost come up with 3 fictional characters, or find 3 students, but I think finding 3 students to agree to this might be a little difficult. So coming up with essentially 3 fictional characters and designing the projects as they would, and showing how, as a teacher, in using journals, you can kind of tailor make a project to them. So if a student wants to go some way because they want to design it in a certain manner, you write it down, pretty much pretending to be another person while I pretend to be a teacher at the same time, and almost make like these 3 stories on a board, which I think is very interesting.
That's so interesting. So,
And then at the same time, I'm also doing their work, so I have little models to show.
That would be so cool, just have like little like intro models of the.
that is cool. So essentially kind
My
of
3 personalities.
doing your own semester of almost like an intro semester yourself from the perspective.
I'm a student and a teacher,
Okay.
but 3 times.
Okay, I understand.
Potentially, maybe.
Potential, at least once, maybe.
At least,
At least once.
I'm definitely going to do it at least once when it comes to, y'all can come in. They've been staring, they've been looking at it for a while. Planning to do at least once to try to capture the concepts spatially, but it would be interesting to also kind of do a play with myself in these, yeah, in a different way of saying.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 major points of focus for your study are focus
Yes.
and design pressure.
Yes.
So maybe, I wonder if narrowing it down like that will help.
I wanna change from focus and rather than focus, but more of engagement. Yeah, I was gonna say motivation, but engagement works
Well,
better.
minimizing distraction.
Yes, but I think they all, it's kind of hard to separate like focus, engagement, motivation, and kind of,
Okay.
all these things are one very broad topic for me because it's hard to separate them all because they're all just expressions of the same problem, if that makes sense.
I like what you said a lot about, having different areas of
Mhm.
works and including private spaces. I think practice that would be kind of hard
Yeah.
to fit in a lot of private spaces. Like what we have in our school now is we have either you're in intro or you're in core or you're surrounded. It's totally open, or you're in MP and you're in a small studio with a few others.
But you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be fully private. Like imagine the kind of segmented MP studios we have, if we had a few of them that were just open for anyone to use as needed, and they're almost designated quiet spaces. Like if you go in there, you're gonna work and be quiet, and you don't have to have very loud music playing the entire night until 3 a.m. whenever you really need to work. So I don't wanna have like one, that's kind of when I said when I wanna make like conceptual rooms in the school, I don't wanna think of it as saying like this is just one solution. Like one thing I talked about with Cook was kind of the way that the teachers' offices are I thought they were hall closets. And they're kind of used like that. I've never seen a teacher. Whenever I talked with Robert Hudson and Bob, we talked in their offices. I was like, I didn't know y'all use these things. And Cook had told me that at his school they had this almost like this kind of lounge working area, and then all the teachers' offices were there with glass windows, so you could see when a teacher was in office, and they could see if you were working. And I think it'd be very interesting to have this kind of open resource at all times, because if you imagine you're in a studio, you're working in the middle of the day, and you're stuck on something, and then you look over and you see there's 30 teachers, and they all have signs on the door that says, please come ask me a question. And you have this problem, you can immediately go and say, I'm stuck, I don't understand, please help me. Rather than the way we have it now, which is boxed in rooms with no light and teachers you can't see.
I feel like that's another thesis though. To
Oh, I know,
redesign space for ADHD is a whole nother, there's both amazing ways to take it, but I feel like they're really
Especially if trying to tackle all of them at once would take more than one semester. So I have been trying to narrow it. I have not quite stuck a nail in exactly how I'm going to do it.
That's all right, you don't need to have done it yet. I think that the amount of research and the direction you're going in, I think you're in a pretty good position to hit the ground running when you get
That
to
is-
too.
That is one thing that I really want to like nail down just for myself, which is I want to do, I want to explore all these different roads, but I want to make sure as I do so, I pick one, explore it as fully as I can, and if I finish, then that's a thesis. But if I want to go on, now it's a thesis plus another little thesis, and I can continue as long as I have literally the steam in me to keep going. So I've heard, there's been a few people that are like, it's very, very broad, and I'm like, yeah, I know, because it's not just one thing. There are multiple design solutions I want to work through. I may not have time to get through all of them, and I understand I need to focus in on one at a time. I think that's more important to me, because I don't want to just say I'm gonna do one thing, because that is one of my problems of I will get tired with that one thing while I'm looking, I'm working on grading, and then in the corner of my eye, it's like, here's a spatial thing, you really wanna start drawing.
I think during this project, it's gonna be extremely important for you to listen to yourself. And, because, right, you'll finish, let's say, and you'll talk about how it's important to let students sort of create their own thing and chase their own rabbit holes, blah, blah, blah. In the end, I'm gonna ask you, did you do that? Did you do that for yourself in this project, and how did it turn out? So I think it's gonna be really important for you to listen to yourself as you're working and do exactly that. Go down, explore, do exactly what you feel that you should be doing in that moment. Go down rabbit holes, explore one avenue fully, and then potentially branch into another one. And really keep track of why you're doing that, like what the feeling is there, what the motivation is behind it, why you're doing that, and is it successful? Is this something that is benefiting you, or not, right? So I think that.
That's a very good way of saying that. And that's like one of the things that it kind of frustrated me early on was I wanted to do these kind of look into teachers, and I was really told not to do that. And then as I finally did it anyways, the conversation that I've had, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense, and I know where I'm going now. So I wholeheartedly agree.
I think it's a very interesting project, and I think it has potential to be very educational and beneficial for the architectural community.
I hope so. I think I'm out of time now, but thank you.
Yeah, good job.